who ended up doing The Wizard of Oz. So they did their own makeups, and Pierce eventually said, you know, the acting thing isn't going to work out, so I'll switch to just doing makeup full-time on other people. And this was one of the first big projects he got. He did others at Universal in the mid-20s, but then he was loaned out to Fox. He also worked at a studio no longer in existence called Vitagraph, which was in the LA basin, as opposed to over the hill for Universal. And Bill Fox brought him over to do this, and he did the Monkey Talks. The actor's name is Jacques Lanier, and yeah, 1927, great makeup. And doesn't it look similar to the Planet of the Apes makeups, which were like 40 years later? Definitely there's an influence there, right? So when John Chambers and the people at Fox were doing Planet of the Apes, I'm sure they referenced this film. Hey, it's a Fox film. Look at how they did the muzzle and the ears and the hairline parted and the brow of the ape. And this was definitely an influence on Planet of the Apes, you know, 40 years later. And this was such a big hit that when Pierce went back to Universal right after this, he was made makeup department head at Universal. There had never even been a makeup department. So they formed a makeup department, made Pierce the head of it in 1928. And the guy who did it was the producer under Carl Laemmle, the head of production, who was Carl Laemmle Jr. So Junior Laemmle made Pierce makeup department head. And one of his first big jobs was The Man Who Laughs, which is the film on the screen now, 1928, right when Pierce was made makeup department head. Carl Laemmle Jr. had the birthday present of being given the studio.
21 years old?
21 years old.
There you go.
1927, you're head of production. So his dad made him, you know, and on top there you can see it says Carl Laemmle Presents. If you look closely on the horror films, it says Carl Laemmle Presents, but then it says produced by Carl Laemmle Jr., right? So he did the early films, Frankenstein, Dracula, The Mummy, up to 1936.
And Scott, speaking of influence, this character that Pierce created certainly influenced the very famous later character,
The Joker, from the Batman movies. So, yes, Bob Kane, when he created the Joker, referenced this character. Gwynplaine, who's this sort of tragic hero. He's got this shock of tousled hair and this wicked grin on his face, these bright lips, and Pierce designed that character. Does anyone know who the actor is? Well, it says it on the screen. Conrad, right? Conrad. And Conrad later starred, of course, in Casablanca, right? He was like the captain in Casablanca. And yeah, Pierce, when he hit it off, of course, he had a thick accent coming from Europe and didn't make it into the sound era like he would have liked, so he went back to Europe, but then came back and did films like Casablanca many years later. Anyway, after The Monkey Talks is a huge hit, this film at Universal is also a big silent movie hit, 28, and now Pierce is firmly not only makeup department head, but he's like a star, right?
Yeah.
He could do these cool things, not only Monkey Talks, but Man Who Laughs. And of course, it was just a couple of years later that they decided to make the horror films once sound came in. You know, sound was in by then, but people were sort of scared of it, so they didn't really start making sound movies until a little bit later in the 20s and of course the very early 30s. So Pierce worked in silence quite a bit at that time. And
You know, if you've not seen The Man Who Laughs, you really need to check it out, because from a performance standpoint, the actor playing, Gwynplaine, there's a certain scene where people are laughing at him because of his disfigurement, and the shame in this guy's eyes and the tears that come, coupled with this forced smile that he's forced to endure for his life. Just, it's so sad. I mean, he's up there with the Elephant Man. It's just incredible acting. I just wanted to point that out. If you get a chance to watch that movie, it really is an acting performance.
Now, Mr. Pearl and I did some scrounging around the Universal Archive, and we found this, which no one's ever seen before. This is Jack Pierce's, what they called original service record. So what you can actually see is a hobble across the stage. $150 a week. So that's 1928, right around the time he did The Man Who Laughs. And then mysteriously his pay drops to $125. So knowing the Laemmles, you know, they probably were cutting budgets at that time. The studio in the early days of Universal was constantly on the verge of going out of business. And it was really the monster movies that kept the studio alive. So speaking of hit monster movies, the next monster movie was, of course, Dracula. And when you look at the publicity stills for Dracula, you'll always see these images. Bela Lugosi doing his own makeup. So I want to ask you gentlemen, Lugosi put on his own makeup for Dracula. What was Jack's specific contribution to this particular film?
Pierce was very disappointed, and there's a good reason why. Right before this, Lon Chaney died, right? So
Like five days before the film went into production, it was right around
the summer of 1930, and I'm sure Pierce saw it as a passing of the torch, right? Chaney had been a huge silent movie star, but because he could do his own makeups. So now Pierce has a chance to do something great with the first of the monster films with Dracula, and then Lugosi says, whoa, 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 whoa. You're not putting makeup on me. I'll do my own makeup, and that's it. And Pierce, I'm sure, referenced the fact that in Lemon After Midnight, Chaney had done that cool vampire character, the man with the beaver hat, right? So he had a chance to do something even better, perhaps, with Dracula until Lugosi put the kibosh on that. So this was probably a huge disappointment to Pierce. And he was relegated to designing the grease paint
and the Widow's Peak.
The Widow's Peak hairpiece and the grease paint that was done through Max Factor's organization. And that was pretty much it. And then Pierce did get to work on, for instance, Renfield. He did that makeup, and he did the Brides of Dracula, those characters. So he got to work on the film. But as far as touching Lugosi, no, didn't happen on Dracula.
Now, after Dracula was such a huge hit, and the studio, the next film was Frankenstein. Most people know this story, but Bela Lugosi was gonna be Frankenstein. And probably the biggest lost relic that I've looked for my whole career, I know you gentlemen have looked for it, is Lugosi did a screen test. They actually did a screen test to play the Frankenstein monster. It's it's like one of the many things that's lost. But from the descriptions that exist, how would you guys describe what that screen test looked like? I've heard it described as like the Golem, the old German expressionist film.
And there was also something about him having stripes or striations of color that...
And a huge wig to make his head so big and large.
The story I heard is when they screened it, people laughed.
Yeah, they said it looked like Babes in Toyland.
So that wasn't going to do it. So obviously, and of course Lugosi, Karloff got the role, and catapulted Karloff to stardom. A couple of images from the days of Frankenstein. You always hear the story, and I heard it all the years when I used to be a tour guide. So I started at Universal. I'd always tell the story. The makeup was so scary. He had to wear a bag over his head, and I went back and found some of the early press that they did for Frankenstein, and it goes something like this. Lemley Sr. was so concerned that makeup would frighten the, quote, pregnant little secretaries. It's a different era, it was a little bit more sexist era. So they, insisted that, whenever Pierce was taking Karloff to set, that he had to wear that bag. I don't know what you gentlemen think. My personal belief on this is this was a pure publicity stunt, that they didn't actually put a bag over his head, but if anybody knows differently, you can contradict me now. But it sounds like, Carl Laemmle was a showman. And, much like William Castle and some of the other people that came after him, he was always trying to spin publicity. And so this picture survives, but I doubt this ever took place, but maybe not.
I think that there's no way that Jack Pierce would let anybody put a bag over his makeup after spending 7 hours in the chair wherever it took. Publicity is definitely one of it. I think it would be for Laemmle was a showman, and he had a lot of pregnant girlfriends, it sounds like, as well, right?
He had a lot of relatives on the lot. We know that. He imported just about every relative from Germany, and they lived all over the lot at that time. You mentioned something like the actual time it took for Boris Karloff to go through the ordeal of having this makeup done. You hear all these different lengths of time that it took Pierce to do this makeup. Is there a definitive time that we know today?
I personally have heard lots of different times. I have no idea. Scott, I reckon, is the guy who's the best person to ask him.
Well, he said on This Is Your Life with Boris Karloff, it took us about 4 hours to put the Frankenstein face in the head on Boris.
Yeah.
So
in an hour to take off?
In an hour and a half to take it off, right. So, they had to start really early, because the studio's not waiting for them to do the makeup. If they have to have the makeup ready for an 8 a.m. shoot, they got to start it at 4 in the morning. That's it. And if they shot at night the night before, too bad.
It's a long day.
Go ahead.
So I was going to say one more comment about the bag on the head. Karloff often slept in the makeup, because if he wore it real late into the night, such as the scene where they're chasing him, the bloodhounds are chasing him with the rocks and all that, and they had to work late into the night. And he's looking at a 4 a.m. makeup call. He probably just said, forget this, and he just probably drove home down Magnolia Boulevard with the full Frankenstein head on. Some passerby probably had a few strange looks.
Yes.
Didn't he forget to water his roses, and that's why he rushed home?
Well, he was a big gardener. Boris Karloff. The funny thing about Boris Karloff is his true love, was gardening. He was a traditional English gentleman. He loved to garden. So, not the stereotypical horror guy.
One more thing about that, he had the whole Frankenstein head on, and then sometimes there'd be studio downtime, right?